you're not all fast asleep and with full stomachs. And like always, I'm over-prepared and have lots of slides, but really happy for them to be shared as we have just a lot of resources and a lot of wisdom to share, and trying to also make sure that we're targeting it to what's going to be helpful for you. So just to let you guys know a little bit about who we are and what we do. The Meridian team is a specialist adolescent team. We're a team of family therapists, and we support families from the age of 10 to 23. And we've been doing that in the Eastern region for about 30 years. And in that time, we have been able to manage to kind of create and maintain a space for therapeutic and relational-based responses to families, and that adolescent violence in the home is something that we had specialised in and developed a program called Breaking the Cycle about 30 years ago. We've been a multi-funded program, which has been wonderful and also really difficult, but what that has allowed us is that we've been able to respond to families across the continuum, and we do often find that might be engaging a family where there's been the first incidence of violence, but also of families where violence and adolescent violence in the home is chronic, and we might have a young person that's violent not only at home but also within the community. I kind of put that in as our Breaking the Cycle family therapy plus trauma-focused group. And really, when we're looking at that particular cohort, we're really seeing a pointy end of a lot of behaviours, and there will often be this level of callousness and severity and frequency of violence that is really rooted in the histories of trauma and abuse. So you will have a young person who is very angry and resentful, is struggling to regulate their emotions in the face of everyday stresses, and they will more often than not, be parented by a single mother who is also dealing with their own trauma. And typically in that more pointy end, they're less likely to be seeking help and support, and that's especially true for families from CALD backgrounds and Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander communities. And because there'll be such fear of their children being removed, or it can be in the face of there kind of being dual victimisation, where you will have the parent being victimised by a current partner or a separated partner, and there is also adolescent violence in the home. So there's a huge amount of shame, guilt, and also an awful lot of mother blaming. You know, you've got an ex-partner or partner blaming the mum for everything. You've got the young person blaming the mum for everything. And often as professionals, we can also be rather blaming of them as well. So as a team, we work with families until the violence has ceased and that their families are saying that the relationships have been significantly improved. Or sometimes we're really working towards supporting what we call a young person's healthy leaving from home. And that often does require the longer term work, and we're having to attend to multi-generational abuse and trauma. And often we're spending a lot of time getting past the crisis and containment to be able to get to the repair and the recovery. We run and developed a program called Breaking the Cycle. It's an 8-week therapeutic group work program for parents and carers that are experiencing adolescent violence in the home. And we also provide family therapy to the young person who is using violence, and also family therapy for the young person and their families. And we find that we engage about 40% of the young people, and the other 60% are really treated via the changes that the parents have made, and that we know in the first instance that the young person is often not a customer for change, and so often it's in supporting the parent or the carer to gain confidence and a new way of managing the violence in the home, that actually there can be pathways for change. We are on the second edition of our facilitator manual and group work program. It's an open resource, so we share it for anybody who asks, and it really is a way for professionals to have a resource with a whole lot of tools and principles of practice to help work with this. And I just say that it really is 30 years of the voice and wisdom of parents and carers and young people, and hearing from them what makes a difference. So this is probably not statistics that we've gathered over about 15 years of our particular work, and what are some of the common characteristics that we see. And, you know, we do notice that where there is adolescent violence, the young person often has other issues that are happening that can be key drivers to their use of violence. We come from a strong position that in order to address these other issues, such as school refusal, disability, mental health, that actually the violence needs to be attended to first. And that despite everything, the young person, even when we do engage them, don't see their violence as the presenting issue. We spend a lot of time in really having a clear definition of what is adolescent violence in the home. You know, there's legally across Australia and all kinds of different ways of framing what is adolescent violence at home, and that does have an impact on policy settings and influence whether we name it, whether we see it, or how we respond to it. So for us it is around that it is any act that creates fear and is intended to hurt a parent or carer or sibling, and can be physical, verbal, psychological, emotional and financial. But we also add that that parents or carers will adjust their own behaviour to accommodate that threat. So what we're kind of saying is that we will have a violent behaviour, and then we also have a reaction to the violence. So we're kind of saying that our core aim is to get violence in all its forms out of the home, and it's the whole family's responsibility. As Jessica and James talked about earlier, there is an adolescent family violence Marram guide being developed. They keep on, it's been under development for 3 or 4 years. I guess one of the key kind of principles which is good to see within it is the acknowledgement that adolescent violence in the home is a very distinct form of violence and requires a very different response to what we see in adult models. And that it's seen within the context of a learnt behaviour, or could be through recruitment by an adult perpetrator, and can be seen as an expression of grief and loss, and that it does require therapeutic and whole of family responses. Apparently it's going to be out by February next year, but who knows? So when we look around the importance of adolescent violence is around being really clear about violent behaviours and having a really good language of describing what often can be really difficult to name, or that, you know, parents or carers will often describe as a rather confusing or belittling issue, and that you know, there will be descriptions of my kid must be bipolar, they're losing it, they're a bit over the top, they're giving me a hard time. So we try really hard to name this as violent behaviour from the very beginning. And also around what violence isn't. So we often find that parents get very caught in becoming really preoccupied in trying to eliminate, avoid and control the problem and the problem young person. And this actually then shapes everybody's interactions within the family. And most of all, the young person just feels scapegoated and doesn't experience the adults in their lives at the least bit helpful. So naming specific behaviours and interactions as violent really helps clarify what's happening and also helps us be really clear about what our role is, and are really identifying the ways in which those interactions can sometimes elicit, fuel, or maintain that problem. And that we also know that a lot of adolescent violence in the home often is happening in the context of common adolescent kind of conflicts around responsibility, money and privilege, or, you know, World War III and trying to get a kid to go to school or to get off the gaming machine or off social media. And so from the very beginning, we are recognising all of that. And we're also, you know, holding in mind that, you know, we're not wanting to have the young person identified as a perpetrator, or that the reasons they're coming for the service is just because of their violent behaviour, because it's so much around their developing identity. You know, we're not wanting them to grow into an identity that violence is okay. And we do also challenge very strongly that belief that violence is part of self-soothing strategies and not about choice or power or control. But we do absolutely acknowledge that violence can be triggered by sensitivities. There is complexity there, that's for sure. When we ask young people about their use of violence, there's a range of contexts in which they choose violence. Well, typically, if I've got a young person and get to the point of asking them around their use of violence, they kind of say, I do it because I can. But if you drill down a little bit deeper as a core kind of theme, what we often notice is that there can be a mother parenting alone, and the young person will often kind of say, well, actually, I feel close to mum. I'm really scared of my dad, and I kind of know that I can be really bad and mum's not going to leave me. We have to hold in mind the importance of that relationship despite the behaviour. More recently, ANROS has put out some recent studies which have been really helpful. Happy to share it with people if they haven't come across it. But this is probably one of the rare surveys done where they've actually asked young people. So they surveyed about 5,000 young people aged between 16 to 20 about their use of violence in the home. And what they found, which won't be a surprise, is most of the young people reported that they had experienced some level of child abuse, and that those young people who used violence had been both witness to and subject to family violence in the home. And that young people with a disability were also more likely to use violence compared to those that didn't have a disability. The self-report was that most of them had begun to use some form of violence at the age of 10. So it's interesting that we've got new funding that's 12 to 17. And that the young people also identified it had a huge impact on their well-being, and that they had significant mental health issues, and that it had a real impact on their relationship with family members and their ability to form healthy and functional attachments outside the family, and that it also had a huge impact on their education because of the level of stress in the home, but also they were really worried that school might find out about the abuse, or that they'd been kicked out or asked to leave the home. So we have a whole of family approach. Nella this morning kind of talked about the 6 C's. This is just a nice visual of the 6 C's in action. I am not going to talk too much about it, but I guess what I am going to say is that there are a huge amount of leverage points within the system and the dynamic where even really small shifts can result in some really big changes. So I often kind of say a family is like a mobile, and sometimes all we need to do is have a small change in one family member, and all the other relationships change. So that's a real focus of kind of the thinking that underpins the work that we do. And we begin to think about the whole family from first engagement, you know, so around deciding who are we working with and why, you know, what's getting in the way of any of the safety planning, you know, when should I start naming violence or using the word violence, and how do I do this? That we're always dealing with complexity, and I'd say that naming dilemmas is a core strategy, and that it's going to have a big impact on us. The more anxious the system is, the more anxious the family is, the more responsibility is going to be handed to you, and boy, you're going to feel it. And we do also ask from the very beginning around whether there is enough goodwill in the family. You know, can we actually repair these relationships, and what does good enough look like? So we're always working with that notion of complexity, that there isn't a magic solution. So actually part of the process is about sitting with what's happening, and timing becomes a really important factor. And it really does require us to remain very grounded and to really, really trust the family. And a lot of the times we're working in really counterintuitive ways. We're kind of saying that common sense parenting doesn't work when you've got a young person that's choosing violence. So a lot of what we're doing is slowing things down, and we're not rushing to solutions. And each family is unique and different, so there's a great opportunity to be creative and to work together, but to really acknowledge that we don't have all the answers. And sometimes families are having to make some really, really tough choices. And so we're often really having to hold that both and, that tension of, you know, whether the family can manage this or not, and what are the consequences of the choices that they're making. So I'll maybe not focus too much on this, but maybe just give a little bit of context, is that we're always listening to stories of adolescent violence from the first contact, and that we're talking about and prioritising the notion of safety for everybody from the first conversation. And we're very contained and strategic in our first interaction. So we're often got the most commonly for us, we have got a parent that's asking for help and support, that they're wanting the relationship to be repaired, not for the young person to be removed from the home. But maybe for those of you that are working with the young person when they're already out of home, you know, it still might be, how might you engage a parent to get their side of the story? You know, and you might be able to ask those questions around, how do you get to the point where the young person's not in the home? Whenever we're asking a parent around, you know, have you been walking on eggshells? You know that there's going to be some kind of power imbalance. Asking around, what was the thing that you least liked about your young person's behaviour? What's a word to describe the relationship with your young person? You know, broken, torn, irreparable. You know, we sometimes have a really good time together, but other times it's really hard. You know, what would they want from supports? And around what are the things they're doing at the moment that might be making a difference. So we're often kind of encouraging that notion that backing off can be a really important strategy to keep things safe, and then also having to really encourage parents that backing off doesn't mean that you're giving in or that your young person has won, and that will often feel really tough for a parent to do. how we go about naming violence is also, we don't want to get the whole sorry story that will just overwhelm them, and you listening for 2 hours about just how bad things are. It's really not helpful. So we might just be asking around, is it getting worse? Or what's the worst it's been? You know, have they threatened to kill and harm? Is there a pattern of escalating violence where the young person then, you know, is threatening self-harm or suicide? You know, is there violence happening? Is the young person being violent in other places? What's their sense of what sets it off? And also really acknowledging that the young person, so absconding, misusing drugs, retreating to their room, not coming home, are all things the young person might be doing to maintain the relationship in the only way they know how. So we really reframe that notion of the young person also making choices towards keeping things safe. We're mapping interactions, and really what we're kind of saying is that it's not just one person who has the problem, but that the interactions can fuel and escalate violence. And around really getting a sense of, can you describe a recent interaction? You know, what was happening earlier in the day? You know, what do you think the young person was wanting or needing? How did you respond? Then what happened? Then what happened? Then what happened? And where was your partner? And where were the siblings? And what did the dog do? And then how did it end? You know, and so that can often also be really encouraging and strength-focused for the parents. And we do also ask a lot about what else is happening in the young person's life. So really hearing the story of where they might be successful. Because the young person, there's a broad range of presentations. So we've got a lot of young people that are ducks of private schools and doing sports and competing well, and they're just violent in the home. It's not just a multi-generational, you know, trauma and abuse kind of family. And also really around that sense of, you know, is the young person refusing to engage in services, and what has the parent tried to do to try to get the young person engaged in any way. And we are also really managing expectations, because often a parent's expectation is that you're going to fix their kid, and after doing that you can send them back to the house and everything will be okay. And I would say that when it comes to to parents and kind of there's some real differences. The breaking the cycle kind of came out of working with parents that were the baby boomer generation, and now we're getting into Gen X and Gen Y. And actually I'm finding that that expectation that professionals can fix their kid is higher. There seems to be higher levels of retaliation and retribution, a higher level of resentment in families, and that you really have to prove that you've got something to offer, and you're working a lot harder to encourage parents to really recognise that they're a really important part of the solution. So we're working harder to work with the families. We're also really thinking through around that sense of reinforcing that sense that parents are really an important part of making changes, and that they can't force the young person into individual counselling and mediation, and that actually we find that having to have the parents cease their own use of violence in their attempts to manage and control their young person needs to be attended to first. So that's why we are always kind of saying that that they have a greater capacity, or we're building their greater capacity to choose non-violence. So there is the MARAM guides that the same have very similar principles that we have embedded within our Breaking the Cycle program. So a little bit around what are the core kind of aims and what we're trying to do. So the core aim really is kind of to get violence out of the home, and we're supporting the parents to also do that through their relationship repair with the young person. We're working with whoever is requesting the service, but like I said, it's typically the parent. And there are real barriers engaging the young person. But we've always got the young person in mind. And we are recognising that the violence significantly disrupts the family relationships and has a destructive impact on all relationships. And that we know that the young person is often, but not always, less prepared to address their own behaviour until the adult has changed theirs. I always kind of say a young person that chooses violence typically has a strong sense of injustice. So if you're talking to them around, you know, their behaviour without acknowledging the injustices that have happened to them, you're not going to get very far, or actually you're going to make things worse. And the reality is that so we're working towards getting the violence out of the home, not the young person. And the reality is that this family has to live together, and actually most of them want to live together. So we're kind of doing that dual dance, a tricky dance around prioritising safety, and achieving safety is the focus of the work. We're not postponing therapy until it's safe. And we're kind of doing it at the same time. And we're always looking at the patterns and the dynamics that are happening. And we're also working with what most families are wanting, which is reconciliation. So mostly parents are asking for the violence to stop and to have a better relationship with their kid. These are kind of the core interventions I've tried to, and each one of these needs to be attended to in some way or another. Sometimes it might just be stepping stones that you are creating for the family, but ultimately these are kind of the core principles that need to be addressed. So we are always talking about stopping the violence. So we talk a lot about the cycle of adolescent violence and the importance of timing, and that we're always naming violent and violent behaviour and holding everybody to account. And that we're also talking around the consequences of safety planning. You know, is using an intervention order actually going to be helpful? In some cases, actually, it's not going to be. And that it can't be a first point of call, but I know that sometimes it is. And we're also looking at what would be the consequences of possible changes. You know, what's going to happen when a parent is going to try to back off, when the young person begins to swear at them. What's going to happen if they choose that they might need to leave the home with the dog and the siblings, and for how long. And so there's some really tough choices. We really can sometimes be working for a very long time to figure out what's going to make a difference. And so, like I said, naming the dilemmas is a part of that process. We're really building confidence and competence, because most parents feel really shamed, really blamed, and like they're really bad parents. I think that, and actually we really have to hear the parent's story before we can actually invite them to make any differences. And that part of adolescent violence disrupting relationships is that parents are in helplessness and hopelessness, can be really, really resentful. And we're trying to shift the focus away from power over dynamics of focusing on trying to manage the problem behaviour towards, you know, kind of inviting responsibility and repairing the relationship around how a parent can regain parental leadership. And what I mean by that is that they're able to hold clear boundaries, that they're able to really listen to the needs and the feelings of the young person without invalidating it, and that they can hold empathy. So often that's what we're building. Often in group work, I think that's where group work can excel. We're always kind of building that notion around also adolescent violence. Adolescence is a stage of transition. It's a life cycle, and adolescence is a huge transition in the relationship. And what we know is that all those abilities to parent their young person, all those teaching opportunities don't happen. So it has a huge impact on the trajectory of the young person. And we're really looking for those small moments of empathic reconnection. And we also know that a lot of the families we're working with have their own experiences of trauma and abuse or neglect. They have a lot of relational wounds, and so we're having to attend to that. When it comes to the group work, we are often, for example, just naming what a trauma response is, that they're not to blame for what's happening for them. But we do find that we are often growing up and healing the wounds of the parent before they can actually do some of what they need. And so we do have to go into doing the trauma recovery with the parents. So we do a lot of EMDR, a lot of internal family systems, a lot of trauma therapies with parents. And we're also really acknowledging the importance of adolescent and brain development. So we're doing an awful lot of reframing, and we're getting parents out of a lot of win-lose battles. So typical relational kind of dynamics that we'll see a lot of win-lose battles, a lot of power over dynamics, and that everybody kind of gets organised around that. We'll often find that the family will stop doing a lot of things that they used to do. Friends don't come over, friends don't come over, family members don't come over. It's too difficult to get out of the house to do anything. And there's often nobody's looking after themselves. The young person is absolutely seen as the problem and scapegoated. And there is an awful lot of couple conflict. So lots of parents will say, this young person has gotten between our relationships. So not only are they violent and abusive, but they're also having an impact on my capacity to function as a parent with somebody, and a huge amount of fights that are happening there. That being said, violence always has a reason for being there. So sometimes it can be that it serves a very important purpose for the young person to be using violence. And there will often be a lot of conditional acceptance and a real sense of a lack of belonging and feeling cut off. So all of that needs to be named and kind of attended to and talked about in some ways. So some of those core strategies is around, I kind of say it's around the parenting with rather than, powering over. And it really is around helping the parents to remain grounded and present in their wise self, and to not be overreacting with rage and anger, or so disconnected and cut off. So it's around everybody learning to self-soothe, to communicate in ways that are more helpful, that safety is always the priority, and it's predictable that violence might escalate after a period of stability, and it doesn't mean that things have gone back to how they were, but sometimes it's also predictable, and that we're always building an awful lot of strengths, and there's a huge amount of strategies and ideas that can be really helpful. So a lot of what relationship repair looks like is around those small opportunities for success. You know, those notions of grand gestures just don't have the effect that the young person is wanting. So those very small moments of sometimes just being side by side with the young person. It might be periods where you can just text them. You might not be able to make eye contact, but you're rebuilding that sense of positive interactions. And also around the parent being able to tune in when the young person is reaching out in some kind of way. And that typically it's going to be up to the parent to initiate the relationship repair, because the young person won't, or forcing the young person to apologise might just escalate more violence. And we also have to recognise the impact of trauma on parenting. You know, the attachment wounds that will have an impact on a parent's ability to self-regulate and to not spill over. And often what you will find is that there will be greater levels of rigidity and reactivity and a lot of black and white thinking. There will be less of a capacity to learn. And sometimes that's the reality of the parents that we're working with. So I think somebody before kind of asked the question around how do you have the conversation with a young person around parents who might have had really significant limitations. And I think that it is part of a family life cycle that it's really difficult to do with a 10, 11 or 12-year-old. You might begin to be able to name it a little bit when they're 15, 16. But often we find that we begin those conversations with a young person when they're younger, and then they come into our service seeking individual support when they're about 17 or 18, and we're more able to then have the conversation around that which was missing in their lives, and around coming to terms with the fact that their parents haven't been there in the way that they were entitled to be. And the huge grief and loss that they experience, and that they're going to have to parent themselves in different ways, and to find those others that are there to nurture them, listen to them, back them up and accept them. So often what we are trying to do with parents is around helping them be aware and to notice their own reactions, that we absolutely need to collaborate with them to not blame or shame or guilt trip them, and that we can recognise that there's a huge loss of trust in humans, and we have to work with that, and actually that's perfectly okay, and that resistance is never a negative reaction, and that they have all kinds of symptoms. And that bite-sizing information is crucial. So this is kind of the flip side around when it comes to working with young people. We're also working towards stopping the violence, but we're really looking at attachment around and recognising that even though the young person might be using violence, that they're actually often feeling really powerless, scapegoated and not too good inside. That we absolutely have to listen to the young person's sense of injustice, and I think especially with Aboriginal, Torres Strait Islander and LGBTQI communities, we really have to tune into a young person's sense of humiliation. And that we're really trying to build trust and trustworthiness, and around addressing their unmet needs, and also around how we can begin to help a young person take responsibility and accountability, and that a lot of what we're having to do really is about timing. It takes time. So we're kind of saying that the first phase when we're engaging with a young person is often around the dance we have with the parents, that actually we need the violence to stop to some degree for the young person to maybe then be willing to talk about what's happening for them, and that forcing compliance, you know, is really often just going to end up with a chair being thrown in the counselling room, or you never seeing that young person again. And so we're really kind of building a young person's readiness to work towards being more open, where there's space to actually engage them. And only then do we begin to talk about the violence and around the notion of accountability and developing responsibility. And a lot of that readiness is really around assessing for goodwill, and that there's an ability to have some level of self-soothing capacity. So we will only bring family members in together when we know that there's a level of safety, that there's a capacity of the young person and the parent or carers to self-soothe, and they're able to all be in their frontal lobes, so they can talk about how to repair the relationship. So just around kind of trust building, it often is around starting really small, you know, that we have to validate the young person's experience. We're doing a lot of safety and modelling of safety by talking about the talking about. So we're not even going to talk about the issues until we're really clear about whether they can manage it or not and what does it look like. And that naming the violence is really tough, but we can kind of introduce the notion that it's a choice. And we really work in a very future-orientated way, because often using the young person's picture of themselves as an adult can be really helpful. I don't want to be like my dad, for example. And that we really need to understand the context. So what need is this young person fighting for? What needs are they trying to get met in their use of violence? And typically it's in total contrast to what the young person's wanting. And they need to know that you can handle it. And that you're not going to be yet another adult that's going to tell them off or shame them, or not listen to them. And we talk a lot about asking them, where does their power lie? And you know, is this how they want to be? And when it comes to trust building, it very much is around not forcing the young person to engage with services, or forcing them to attend a service without their consent or knowledge. And there's been enough times that I've had a lovely conversation with a parent, make a time to see them, and they turn up with the kid in tow and they've got no idea why they're there and who you are. And so we really have to kind of be really clear with the young person, and around, you know, what's okay and what's not okay, and being really, really reliable. And we talk a lot around what parts of information we can share, and what needs to be made confident. So we work in a team. There is 8 of us, so we do an awful lot of co-therapy. We'll often have one counsellor working with the young person and another working with the parent or the grandparents or the ex-partner. Or sometimes it is that we've got one practitioner working with the whole family. So we really hold it together. This work is complex and you can't do it alone. And we always hold the most generous interpretation possible for the young person's intentions, words or actions. And we try to encourage that the parents hold that empathy as well. And when it comes to engaging the young person, we're really listening for how the violence organises the interactions from the young person's perspective. It will always be their sense of injustice and their protest and their defence around humiliation and shame. We'll be looking for exceptions, and there's always exceptions. And we'll be listening to the young person's beliefs and values, and also around their experiences and love and connection. And gee, sometimes that's the goldfish or the dog. So that can be huge. And it's lots of young person are really wanting to feel heard. And so the relationship you have with the young person can be a real soother in and of itself. And by listening to the young person's story, we're really modelling that mutual respectful relationship that often can be missing. And we're really trying to teach the young person to use language to express their emotions and describe what they're feeling, so they're less likely then to act it out. These are just kind of questions that we find work. That being said, this would typically be something that will, happen over quite a long time. And when you've really got a trusting relationship with a young person, there has to be some level of relationship with them to begin to go there. So to be able to ask around, whether they want anything to be different, and how do they see the problems in the home, and what do they think that they need. We will talk about the cycle of adolescent violence, and around them noticing what's happening inside their body, what's their earliest warning signs. We're planting a lot of seeds around, what are things that are getting them upset, but what are signs in which, they might be able to ask for their needs to be met. And what might be one small thing that a young person can do. And we'll often then try to seek permission that the parents and siblings are also aware of what the young person is trying to do. If they bugger up, that's predictable and it's okay. And so we can ask around what worked until what time, and then what happened, and what was the one thing that helped them get back on track. When we're looking around accountability, it often is around, how might they handle feelings, because we're talking about hard things. What amount of time out or a break do they need? Is there anything that I need to know? What might happen after they leave a session with us? Is mum or dad going to come pick them up? Are they going to escalate in their violence? And then we check in what happens, because we really need to know. What it might be important for me to say to their parents, so that everybody's on the same page, or what their worries might be if we let a parent know, especially if we've got a parent that still might be misusing violence as well. Naming the violence can be really challenging. We can use words such as stress and difficulties, whether they want things to be better at home, whether the relationship is completely broken, who's most concerned around what's happening, is there something that they've regretted recently, and what it feels like for them to be out of control. So young people will often kind of say, I lost it and I can't remember what happened next. And there can be a real sense of like, shit, that's really hard to manage, that I can get that out of control. It can be really frightening. And we're often also asking around what kind of relationships might they be wanting, and how might they look a little bit different. And sometimes they just say, I just want my parents to listen to me. I just wish Dad would, take me cycling with him. We used to hang out in the shed and he stopped doing that. My mum's repartnered, and I just feel forgotten. So often there will be, real sadness around that which they haven't experienced. So like I said, what most young people want from their parents is to be able to talk, for the parents to listen and understand, not shout at them, to have some quality time, but also space to grow and to calm down. and they often do want to talk to somebody that isn't family about what's happened to them. That's it.